It was last Halloween. I remember you had shared a list of tips for Halloween night. One of those tips was to leave food out for the little people. Normally, I only do something like this when something of mine goes missing, but given the night it was, I decided the occasion seemed to fit. I prepared a small offering of homemade chocolates and lavender cookies I had made, plus a small glass of mead. My boyfriend laughed at me and told me I was silly for even considering doing such a thing. He's a very scientific person, and the thought of anything magical or otherworldly is just not considered in his mind. I rolled my eyes at him and left the snacks out. He had to keep making comments that my whole fairy thing was cute or silly, and he sincerely hoped I didn't actually believe any of it. I made it clear that I cannot say whether I believe in it or not, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. I should note that this year I bought a bunch of animatronic crows to use as Halloween decorations. I managed to find one that I was particularly drawn to a month or so prior to Halloween, and since then I just bought up everyone I encountered. I wasn't sure why, but crows and ravens particularly spoke out to me at this time. The original crow that started it all wasn't very special. It sat in a cage and its eyes would light up and wings would flap as it cawed at you. You could have it set to go off whenever anything came near it or to go off when you pushed a button on it. I didn't want it going off all the time, so I set it to button mode. For whatever reason, that night I decided to set the treats on a small table right next to this particular bird. Anyways, the day after Halloween, everything was normal. I went out to do some errands as my boyfriend slept. He works nights, so he sleeps all day long. And upon returning from my chores, he muttered to me, "Could you turn the bird off? It won't stop." I gave him a puzzled look, but he remained silent after that. I just assumed he was talking in his sleep, so I continued on with my day. I went to work, he went to work, same old, same old. The next day, I saw him. He was awake now, and he seemed a little annoyed as he reminded me of the day before. "I thought I asked you to make sure the bird was off." I gave him a puzzled look. "The bird?" "Yeah, the one by the table. It keeps going off and flapping its wings and cawing. I thought you turned off the motion sensor." I stopped what I was doing and went to inspect the little bird. I couldn't figure out what my boyfriend was talking about. It hadn't gone off once as far as I could see. I checked its settings and pushed its button. It went off normally. So I shrugged it off and changed its batteries. My boyfriend kept giving me weird looks when I told him it was perfectly fine. This went on for about a week. My boyfriend kept complaining that my animatronic bird would keep going off whenever he was home alone. It would go off spontaneously and wake him up in his sleep, or when he was showering or just playing video games. He kept insisting it must be broken, or its wiring was going bad or something. I was so confused. I was honestly home alone more often than he was, and I hadn't seen this bird go off once. It was on the 7th day I remember leaving the house for just a minute as I took the trash out. I came back in the door and my boyfriend had shot up and was pointing at the bird. "Aha! It did it again! Did you see it? Did you see it?" I looked down at the bird and admitted that I was outside and didn't see or hear anything. It was then something clicked in me. I burst out laughing. He looked at me confused and asked what was so funny. "You made fun of me for believing in fairies, and now I think they're trolling you." He gave me a funny look and went back inside. The bird hasn't gone off on its own ever since. We had bought it in early September, and none of this ever started happening until just after Halloween night. It's now kept in the spare room. I push its buttons from time to time just because it makes me smile whenever I think about it. It's been about a year since this happened, and I've tried to put it out of my mind as best I can. I'm typically a very logical person, one who takes almost all things with a bit of healthy skepticism, but I still cannot explain this mystical event. Although I try my best to think things through carefully, I do believe in the Fae, and have even come to fear them to some degree, especially in my adult years, mostly because of their elusive nature. My best friend and I consider ourselves relatively well versed in fairy lore, and are pretty good at spotting signs of what most fables describe as fairy dwellings or markers. Perhaps that is why she chose us. Last summer, my best friend and I took a long weekend trip to my family cabin, which sits along the shore of Lake Huron. When we arrived, I found a single black feather just in front of the steps to the door. I decided to keep it, considering it a gift from nature, and perhaps from the Fae folk themselves. That first night, we got considerably drunk, so we didn't really get out of bed the next day until the evening, around 5 p.m. It was then that I looked out the bedroom window and saw another black feather. Later, we made up our minds to head to a roadside park that overlooks the lake. Parking in the further of two lots, we headed towards the staircase that led down to the beachfront, our eyes peeled for anything interesting to do or look at. We both have a very keen eye for nature and can appreciate the beauties and mysteries it has to offer. So you can imagine our wonderment when we saw a tree that seemed to be covered in shapes that looked like eyes. Like I said, I'm a healthy skeptic, but this tree gave me a very eerie feeling, like we were being watched. Nevertheless, we carried on. But not more than 10 feet past this tree, we noticed a symbol spray painted onto the railing alongside the road. It was a cat's head with a capital A in the middle, where the slash going through extended into whiskers. We figured it was strange to see graffiti out here, since most of the occupants in the area were elderly retired people, or just lakeside cabins like my family had. But it didn't really bother us. It didn't even bother us when we saw a second one on the back of a sign posted just before the staircase leading down. Climbing down the stairs to the beach, my best friend immediately spotted something she wanted. A rock. A giant rock, mind you, that was buried in the sand so that only a small amount was visible from the surface. I had recently taken a geology class, so she liked to find rocks on the beach so I could identify them for her and tell her a little bit about their history. So I sat back as she dug this thing out for about 10 minutes or so. It turned out to be much bigger than she imagined, so it had left a considerably large hole behind when I pushed it out for her. Now, my best friend has a tendency to be much more adventurous than I am. I know how to have fun, but I am a bit of a realist, so I typically have to be the one to pull my friend off of fallen branches or deter her from precarious or potentially dangerous situations. This is precisely why it was so strange that I had suddenly felt a pull, like a nagging sensation that drew me further along the beach. Instead of her leading the way, I had taken her usual place, climbing over boulders and branches, leading us eventually up a short path that opened into a massive man-made dam. It was here that the world seemed to fall completely silent. Like I mentioned before, there was a road nearby where we had seen the first cat symbol. It was the busiest road in the area, and although it certainly wasn't a city street or an expressway, it generated its fair share of noise. But not even the cars or semi-trucks could be heard in this place, which was quite strange considering its expansive nature, and what I would imagine in any other situation would be rather generative of echoes. We hardly had the time to think about how strange it was, however, before we both turned around simultaneously to see a cat emerge from the underbrush. She looked relatively normal for a cat, with beautiful striped black and brown patterns. The only real abnormality was her eyes, huge and practically glowing. They were the brightest, most yellow eyes I have ever seen on a cat in my life. And she had no reservations about approaching us right away, rubbing on our legs, purring loudly. To our surprise, she even allowed us to pick her up, albeit for short periods of time. My best friend looked right at me with the cat in her arms and said, "Serenity." And we both knew without a doubt that that was the cat's name. My best friend set the cat back down, and she looked up at us before sauntering off, even checking over her shoulder for us. Curious, we followed her. She took us all around the beach, leaving her prints in the sand as she weaved through plants and around obstacles until eventually taking us to a small creek that ran into the lake. It was here that she began to hunt, right in front of us. In fact, she had nearly caught a frog before one of us accidentally scared it away. We learned, however, that she was a very experienced hunter and likely accustomed to fending for herself because of her practical usage of her dew claw, a skill most domestic cats do not have. After we scared away her prey, she led us further into the woods and quickly scampered up a massive fairy hill. This is where things began to fall into place in our minds. "Is this your home?" I asked. But she just kept going, and like sheep, we followed her all the way back to the parking lot where she sat right in front of our car, almost expectantly. Unsure of what else to do, we just put her in the back seat and decided to take her back to the cabin to feed her. For what we assumed was a stray, Serenity was extremely comfortable in the car. In fact, she'd even fallen asleep in the back seat. That is, until we came across a litter of strays in the middle of the road. Insisting I pull over when we approached this litter of kittens, my best friend got out of the car and attempted to approach them. And Serenity immediately became distressed, moving between the back and front seats and looking out the window while meowing aloud, watching my friend. "What's the matter?" I asked her. "Do you know them?" She meowed in reply. "Did they hurt you? Are they bad?" I continued, to which she meowed again. Before I could ask anything else, my best friend got back in the car. "They tried to attack me," she said to my surprise. "There's 5 kittens and a mom, and they tried to attack me." I couldn't believe it. I told her about what happened with Serenity while she was gone, and the color drained from her face. I finally began to realize just how afraid she was. Like I said near the beginning, I have come to fear the Fae to some extent, but my best friend is more or less comfortable with them, or at least the concept of them, which is why her being afraid was so strange while I felt so calm. Nevertheless, we took Serenity home. As a joke, I presented 2 cans to her, one of tuna and the other of chicken, not expecting her to know what they were. First of all, she knew they meant food. Second of all, she chose the chicken. After she was finished eating, Serenity wandered the cabin as if she belonged there, even going so far as to lay on the ottoman for a nap. I cleaned some dishes while my friend stayed with her, but when I returned, my friend was nearly asleep. Keep in mind, we had only been awake for a few hours at this time. "She's draining my energy," was all my friend said. We decided to take the cat back. Fairy or not, Serenity was clearly doing well for herself out there, and we certainly couldn't keep her ourselves since we both had cats at home. It felt like she belonged there anyway. Besides, she was already meowing at the door. When I tried to unlock the door to load her up, it simply wouldn't open. For 10 minutes, I tried to open it without setting off the alarm, but it went off at least twice before finally working. Then I couldn't seem to get the front door locked. In fact, I actually had to leave it unlocked because it simply wouldn't work. When we drove Serenity back, she fell asleep on the dashboard, only waking up when we neared the place we had seen the other cats before. Letting Serenity free, we followed her for a short while to be sure she didn't go towards the road. It was then that she led us directly to a giant circle of mushrooms, one of many. They were fairy rings, all of which were definitely not there before. This we know for sure because we had parked in the same spot as before, and being quite good at spotting these sorts of things, had not seen them. Serenity sat directly in the middle of one of the rings and stayed there as we drove away. I looked in the rear view only once to see her eyes, shining, almost like headlights, bright and blinding in my mirror. When we got back, my friend showed me a few photos she had taken of the cat while I had been cleaning. Most of the photos were blurry, but in the ones that weren't, Serenity's eyes were pitch black. How is this possible? We were both sure that the cat had yellow eyes. That night, I woke up to my friend sitting straight up in bed, eyes closed, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The only word I understood was cat. But I couldn't be sure if it was English or not. As much as I wanted to wake her up, I couldn't muster the energy and fell back asleep within seconds. The next morning, my friend reported that not only had I done the same thing, but that she also had been hearing kittens meowing all night. As I made breakfast, she was texting a friend who said that his cat was trying to type on his phone, as cats usually are invasive in that way. Curious and still shaken about the night before, my friend told him to let the cat do it. Moments later, she received a text that, among a bunch of gibberish, read, "We get 7. Her friend has an outdated phone without autocorrect, so something so coherent and all the rest was strange to see, and stranger still when we recalled the 6 cats we had seen in the road the day before. 5 kittens, 1 mum, and Serenity. 7 cats. With so many questions, we decided to return to where we found Serenity and try to find her again. Retracing our steps, we found that not only was the hole left behind by my friend's excavation gone, but so was the big rock. There were no paw prints in the sand either, nor were there any traces of our steps from the day before. But the Fae rarely show their faces when you try to find them again. Instead, we found one last feather. This one was black with white stripes, unlike the others which had been solid black. It wasn't until later research we had done weeks after the events that we learned that the black feathers meant protection, and the striped one represented an initiation into the spirit realm. We also tried to find any record of the cat graffiti we saw, only to find an exact match of it in a photo from someone's trip to Barcelona that we found on a picture website. This happened a year ago, but it is still so vivid in my mind. I don't know if we'll ever find the answers to our questions about what we experienced that day, but I often think about Serenity and wonder if she'll ever visit us again, and if, when that day comes, we'll find the answers we seek, for better or for worse. As a Celtic pagan, I have believed in fairies my whole life. My grandparents are from Scotland and used to tell me stories about the little folk. A lot of their stories were harmless and fun. They always referred to these as Seelie stories. The Seelie would do things like move your stuff to weird spots, play music and dance in the night, and cause general, if harmless, mischief. But as I got older and more independent, my grandpa sat me down and said, "It's time you learn about the uncie." He went on to tell me frightening stories and to describe the uncie as malicious, stealing children, taking things of value and trading them for fairy gold, which was actually leaves and sticks enchanted to look like gold. They could even go so far as to cause harm or even death to humans. As I got older, I started to question these fairy tales I was told as a kid. That is, until about 2 years ago. It started with a dream. I fell asleep and it was like I'd woken up in a different world. It was the most beautiful garden and I was sitting in a gazebo in the center. I could hear haunting music coming from the hedge that surrounded the garden. Looking around, I noticed that the woodwork of the gazebo was carved with images of little people and leaves and vines. It was all very magical. At this point, I felt like something was drawing me out of the garden. So I walked to an opening in the hedge where I could hear the music the loudest. I couldn't see where the music was coming from, and I was trying to figure it out when it dawned on me that I had heard this music before. One night when I was a kid and was staying with my grandparents, I heard this exact melody coming from outside my grandparents' house. But they told me it was the fairies having a dance, and I must not disturb them. My grandpa especially always insisted I avoided all fairy contact no matter what. So inside the dream, I remembered my grandpa's advice, and I decided not to follow the music and to stay there in the garden. It suddenly got very dark and cold, and then I woke up feeling like whatever had brought me to that dream world was unhappy that I hadn't followed the music. 30 seconds later, my alarm went off, and I remember laying there questioning if what I had experienced was even a dream because it had felt so real. A few weeks later, I was having tea with my grandparents and I told them about this crazy dream, and they looked horrified. "You must never fall for their tricks," my grandpa said. "You were in turn a nog. They brought you to their world, and if you had fallen for their trap, you would have never woken up." Then, frantically, my grandpa raised his voice and said, "Promise me, if the dream happens again, you will never leave the garden." I promised him I would follow his orders. The rest of my visit, he seemed really lost in thought and unsettled. Over the following few months, this dream became more and more frequent. Sometimes I could smell delicious food or hear voices that sounded like my friends or family, calling me by name, trying to lure me out of the garden, though the voices never sounded quite right. After every dream, I woke up feeling like I hadn't rested at all. At this time, I worked alone at night as a heavy equipment mechanic. I often had some pretty tight deadlines to get machines back up and running. There were times during these nights when I could have sworn I could hear people walking or talking back and forth in what was supposed to be an empty building. Whenever this happened, I would grab a large pry bar and search the whole building, only to find nothing. I spoke with some of the other mechanics about their late night experiences, and they all told me they had heard similar noises, and everyone pretty much agreed the place was haunted. Then the dreams changed. Things like wild animal sounds or even fire would try to force me from the garden and into the hedge, but I resisted every time. It was then that I started to believe 100% that all those fairy tales from my youth were real. Then, after these dreams suddenly stopped for about 2 months, they came back. And this time, I wasn't alone in the gazebo. There was a wolf in there with me. The wolf was vicious. It would attack me, chase me around the garden, trying to force me into the hedge. After one of these dreams, I awoke more tired than ever and tried to drive to work, but as I was on the highway leaving the city, I hit a patch of fog, and after driving under a street light, I saw something that looked like a small child standing in the road. I slammed on the brakes, swerved, and ended up halfway in the ditch. Then I jumped out of my Jeep and ran back to see if I had hit someone, but there was no one there. All I could find was the skid marks from my panicked stop while going 100 kilometers per hour. Shaken, I started to sing a song my grandma used to sing to help me sleep when I was a kid, and I walked back to my Jeep. Once back on the road, the fog lifted, and I drove to the shop. The next day, in a phone call to my grandparents, I told them what had happened. They said the uncie must be angry with me for constantly refusing to leave the garden in my dream. The thing is, I hadn't told my grandparents I was still having that dream. They just seemed to know. My grandma told me to plant a fairy garden around my house to attract Seelie fairies to my home and drive out the uncie. So that day, my wife and I did just that. Since then, the dreams still do happen from time to time, but there's no music, no fire, no vicious wolf, no attempt to draw me out. I just sit there in the gazebo at complete peace with the world and have the best night's sleep. Because of all that, I 110% believe in my heart that fairies are real. I am a 28-year-old male, and I won't ever doubt their existence again. Thanks for watching, and thanks to all the subscribers who shared their stories for this one. And of course, special thanks, as always, goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. I really appreciate you guys, and your support means the world. If you like this content and you'd like to support it on Patreon, there's a link in the description below, including several other support options as well. And if you have a fairy encounter to share, I'm always happy to receive those, so please don't hesitate to send them along. You'll find my email in the description. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you're new, and press that bell for notifications. And until next time, this has been a visit from your Scary Fairy Godmother.